The foundation of Prince William's extraordinary journey began long before he ever slept on London's streets. It started in the warm embrace of his mother's arms, and the revolutionary idea she planted in his young mind. Diana, Princess of Wales, was not content to raise future kings who would wave from golden carriages and cut ribbons at fancy ceremonies. She wanted her sons to understand that true nobility came from serving those who had the least. William was just 11 years old when his mother first took him to the Passage, a day center for homeless people in central London. The smell hit him first, a mixture of unwashed bodies, cheap disinfectant, and something he couldn't quite identify but would later learn was desperation mixed with hope. His small hand gripped his mother's tightly as they walked through rooms filled with people who looked nothing like anyone he had ever met. There was Margaret, an elderly woman whose eyes held stories of loss that made William's chest feel tight. She had been a teacher once, she told him, before her husband died and the grief consumed everything else in her life. She lost her home, her job, her sense of purpose, until she found herself here, grateful for a cup of tea and a sandwich that kept her alive for another day. There was James, barely older than William himself, who had aged out of the care system with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. His clothes were too big for his thin frame, and when he smiled at William, the young prince could see that several of his teeth were already missing. James spoke about sleeping in doorways and learning which shopkeepers would let him use their toilets and which ones would call the police. Diana watched her son carefully that day, seeing how his face changed as he listened to these stories. She saw him struggle to understand how people could fall so far from the life he knew, where every need was anticipated and every comfort provided. But she also saw something else in his expression, a spark of recognition that these were real people with real stories, not just problems to be solved from a distance. The drive home was quiet. William stared out the window at the streets they passed, now seeing them differently. Every doorway might shelter someone like James. Every park bench might be someone's bed. Every person walking alone might be carrying the kind of pain that Margaret held in her eyes. When they finally reached Kensington Palace, the golden gates and manicured gardens felt almost absurd in their perfection. That night at dinner, William asked questions that made the adults around him uncomfortable. Why didn't homeless people just get jobs? Why couldn't they live with their families? Why didn't the government just give them houses? His questions revealed both his innocence and his genuine desire to understand something that seemed impossibly complex. Diana answered each question with patience and honesty. She explained how mental illness could make it impossible to hold a job, how addiction often started as a way to escape pain that felt unbearable, how many homeless people had no families to turn to because they had been rejected for being different or had grown up in systems that failed them. She told him about the spiral that could begin with one piece of bad luck and end with someone sleeping rough, and how once that spiral started it became almost impossible to stop. Over the following months, Diana continued taking William to homeless shelters, soup kitchens, and day centers. Each visit added layers to his understanding of a problem that was far more complicated than he had imagined. He met war veterans whose minds had been broken by things they had seen and done in service to their country. He met women who had fled abusive relationships with nothing but the clothes on their backs. He met teenagers who had been thrown out of their homes for being gay or transgender, left to navigate a world that seemed designed to crush anyone who didn't fit perfectly into its narrow expectations. But he also met the helpers, social workers who showed up every day despite being overworked and underpaid, volunteers who spent their weekends ladling soup and listening to stories, former homeless people who had found their way back to stability and now dedicated their lives to helping others find the same path. These people fascinated William even more than those they served, because they proved that it was possible to make a difference one person at a time. As William grew older, his visits to homeless services became less guided by his mother and more driven by his own curiosity and growing sense of responsibility. He began to see patterns in the stories he heard, how childhood trauma often led to mental health problems, which led to difficulty in school, which led to unemployment, which led to homelessness. He saw how once someone became homeless, every system they encountered seemed designed to make their situation worse rather than better. He watched how people who had been sleeping rough for months were expected to navigate complex bureaucracies to access services, how they were judged and dismissed by people who had never missed a meal or slept in the cold. He saw how society's response to homelessness often focused on moving the problem rather than solving it, how cities would pass laws making it illegal to sleep in public spaces without providing alternatives, how people would donate money to homelessness charities while supporting politicians who cut funding for mental health and affordable housing. The contradiction frustrated William deeply. He began to understand that homelessness wasn't really about housing at all, it was about how society treated its most vulnerable members, about whether people believed that everyone deserved dignity and support regardless of their circumstances, about whether the community would rally around those who were struggling or abandon them to fend for themselves. When William turned 18, he made a decision that surprised many people around him. Instead of celebrating his milestone birthday with a grand party or exotic vacation, he asked to spend a night sleeping rough on the streets of London. Palace officials were horrified by the idea, citing security concerns and protocol violations. But William was determined, and he had learned from his mother that sometimes the most important things a future king could do were the ones that made palace officials uncomfortable. The night he chose was in December, with temperatures dropping below freezing and a bitter wind that cut through even the heaviest coats. William dressed in ordinary clothes, jeans, boots, a worn jacket that one of his security team had provided. He carried a backpack with a sleeping bag, a bottle of water, and a few energy bars, the kind of supplies that homeless outreach workers distributed to people living on the streets. His security team wanted to stay close, but William insisted they keep their distance. He wanted to experience something as close to the real thing as his position would allow. He found a spot near Blackfriars Bridge, in an area where he knew other people slept rough regularly. The ground was concrete, cold and unforgiving beneath his body. The sleeping bag that had seemed adequate in the palace suddenly felt paper-thin against the winter air. Within an hour, William understood something that no amount of visiting shelters could have taught him. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. It seeped into his bones and made it impossible to think about anything else. His body shivered uncontrollably, and every sound made him jump. A group of drunk men passed by shouting and laughing, and for a moment William felt the vulnerability that homeless people described, the fear of being attacked or robbed when you had no safe place to retreat. But the worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the fear. It was the invisibility. Throughout the night, hundreds of people walked past his spot. Some stepped around him, some stepped over him, but almost all of them acted as if he simply didn't exist. A few dropped coins into a cup he hadn't even put out, apparently assuming he was begging. No one stopped to ask if he was okay, if he needed help, if there was anything they could do. He was just part of the street furniture, something to be navigated around but not acknowledged as human. As the hours passed, William began to understand how that invisibility could break a person's spirit, how it could convince someone that they truly didn't matter, that their life had no value, that they deserved whatever terrible circumstances had brought them to this point. He thought about Margaret and James and all the other people he had met over the years, and he realized that the worst part of their situation might not have been the lack of shelter or food, but the way the world had decided they were worth ignoring. When dawn finally came, William was shivering so violently that he could barely pack up his sleeping bag. His back ached, his feet were numb with cold, and his head pounded from lack of sleep. But more than anything, he felt changed. The night had stripped away any romantic notions he might have had about homelessness and replaced them with a raw understanding of how quickly dignity could be lost, and how hard it was to reclaim. On the drive back to the palace, William made a promise to himself. He would never forget what that night had taught him about vulnerability, about invisibility, about how society treated people who fell through its cracks. He would use every privilege and platform available to him to make sure that others didn't have to endure what he had experienced, and that those who were already enduring it would not be forgotten or ignored. That promise would shape the next 20 years of his life, driving him to become one of the most effective advocates for homeless people in British history. But it all started with that single night on the streets, when a young prince learned that the crown on his head would only have meaning if he used it to serve those who had nothing at all. The morning after his night on the streets changed everything for Prince William, but not in the way that palace advisors expected. They had hoped the harsh reality would satisfy his curiosity about homelessness and convince him to focus on more traditional royal duties. Instead, it ignited a determination that would reshape how the monarchy engaged with social issues and how society thought about its most vulnerable members. Within weeks of his rough sleeping experience, William began reaching out to organizations across Britain that worked with homeless people. He didn't just want to make ceremonial visits or write checks from a distance. He wanted to understand the entire ecosystem of homelessness, from the frontline workers who provided immediate help to the policymakers who shaped the systems that either supported or failed vulnerable people. His first major partnership was with Centrepoint, an organization that specialized in helping young homeless people. The charity had been working with young people experiencing homelessness for over 50 years, and their approach appealed to William because it focused on getting to the root causes of youth homelessness, rather than just managing its symptoms. He spent days shadowing their outreach workers, learning how they built trust with young people who had every reason to be suspicious of adults offering help. Maria Santos, a veteran outreach worker at Centrepoint, became one of William's most important teachers during this period. She had been working with homeless youth for 15 years, and she had seen every approach tried and failed. What worked, she explained to William, wasn't grand gestures or one-size-fits-all solutions. What worked was showing up consistently, listening without judgment, and understanding that every person's path to homelessness was different, which meant every person's path out of homelessness would be different too. Maria took William into parts of London he had never seen, despite having lived in the city his entire life. They visited squats where teenagers were living in buildings without heat, electricity, or running water, because it was still safer than whatever situation they had escaped. They met young people outside train stations and in 24-hour fast food restaurants, places where someone could sit for hours without being asked to leave. One of the young people who made the deepest impression on William was a girl named Emma, who was only 16 but had been living on the streets for 8 months. She had grown up in foster care, moving between homes where she never felt safe or wanted. When she turned 16, she had aged out of the system with nowhere to go and no support network to catch her. She was intelligent and articulate, but she had never learned the basic life skills that most people took for granted: how to budget money, how to maintain a tenancy, how to navigate the benefit system. Emma's story helped William understand how society's safety nets had dangerous gaps that caught the most vulnerable people. She hadn't chosen to become homeless because she was lazy or irresponsible. She had become homeless because the systems that were supposed to protect children had failed her, and when she became an adult, there were no backup systems in place to help her succeed. But Emma's story also showed William the power of the right kind of intervention. Maria and her team didn't just offer Emma a place to stay. They worked with her to develop life skills, supported her through the trauma that had led to her homelessness, helped her access education and training programs, and most importantly, treated her as a capable person who deserved respect and dignity. Within 6 months, Emma was living in her own flat and working toward her education goals. Within 2 years, she had become a peer mentor for other young people experiencing homelessness. Inspired by stories like Emma's, William began to see that homelessness wasn't an unsolvable problem. It was a complex challenge that required long-term, coordinated responses, but it was absolutely solvable if society was willing to invest the time, money, and political will necessary to address its root causes. This realization led William to expand his network beyond direct service providers to include researchers, policy experts, and government officials. He spent time with academics who studied the economics of homelessness and discovered that preventing homelessness was almost always less expensive than managing it after it had occurred. He learned about successful models from other countries, like Finland's Housing First approach, which had virtually eliminated rough sleeping by providing people with stable housing first, and, then, addressing the issues that had led to their homelessness. William also began building relationships with people who had experienced homelessness themselves and were now in positions to influence policy and practice. These individuals brought a perspective that no amount of academic study could provide. They understood from personal experience what worked and what didn't, what helped and what hurt, what gave people hope and what crushed their spirits. One of these individuals was David Thompson, who had spent 3 years sleeping rough before finding stable housing and becoming a social worker specializing in homelessness services. David became one of William's closest advisors on homelessness issues, helping him understand the lived reality behind the statistics and policy debates. David's own story was both heartbreaking and inspiring. He had been a successful accountant until a combination of job loss, relationship breakdown, and untreated depression had led to a downward spiral that ended with him living under bridges in Manchester. He described to William how quickly a stable middle-class life could collapse, and how once you became homeless, every system you encountered seemed designed to keep you trapped rather than help you escape. But David also described the moment when everything changed for him, when an outreach worker named Sarah treated him not as a problem to be solved but as a person with value and potential. Sarah had connected him with not just housing but also mental health support, job training, and most importantly, a community of people who believed in his ability to rebuild his life. David's transformation from homeless person to social worker illustrated something crucial that William was beginning to understand, that people experiencing homelessness weren't broken individuals who needed to be fixed, but capable human beings who needed the right support and opportunities to rebuild their lives. The most effective homelessness services were those that recognized and built on people's existing strengths, rather than focusing only on their problems. As William's understanding of homelessness deepened, he began to see connections between different social issues that he hadn't recognized before. He learned that many people experiencing homelessness had been in the criminal justice system, often for minor offenses related to their homelessness itself: sleeping rough, begging, public drinking. Once someone had a criminal record, it became much harder to find housing and employment, creating a cycle that trapped people in homelessness. He discovered that many women experiencing homelessness were fleeing domestic violence, but that refuges were often full, and waiting lists were long, forcing women to choose between staying in dangerous relationships or risking homelessness. He learned that young LGBT people were vastly overrepresented among homeless youth, often because they had been rejected by families who couldn't accept their sexual orientation or gender identity. These connections helped William see that addressing homelessness effectively required working on multiple issues simultaneously: criminal justice reform, domestic violence prevention, LGBT acceptance, mental health services, addiction treatment, and affordable housing. It wasn't enough to focus on just one piece of the puzzle. The entire system needed to be addressed if real progress was going to be made. This systems thinking approach led William to begin convening meetings between organizations that traditionally worked in isolation from each other. He brought together housing providers, mental health services, job training programs, criminal justice reform advocates, and domestic violence organizations to talk about how they could coordinate their efforts more effectively. These meetings weren't just talk sessions. William used his position and resources to help organizations develop concrete collaborations that improved outcomes for the people they served. He helped fund pilot programs that tested new approaches to coordinated service delivery. He connected organizations with similar missions but different specialties so they could learn from each other and avoid duplicating efforts. One of the most successful initiatives that grew out of these collaborations was a program that provided wraparound services for young people leaving foster care. Instead of aging out of the system with no support, young people were connected with housing, education, job training, mental health services, and peer mentoring in a coordinated package that addressed all the factors that put care leavers at high risk of homelessness. The program's success rate was remarkable. Over 85% of participants remained stably housed 2 years after leaving care, compared to less than 40% for young people who didn't receive the coordinated support. The program was so successful that it was expanded to multiple cities and became a model for similar initiatives across Europe. But William's work wasn't limited to funding and convening. He continued to spend time directly with people experiencing homelessness, both to stay connected to the human reality behind the policy debates and to ensure that his advocacy was grounded in real experience rather than theoretical understanding. These ongoing relationships taught him that sustainable solutions to homelessness required more than just providing services. They required changing how society thought about poverty, vulnerability, and social responsibility. Too many people still believe that homelessness was the result of individual moral failures rather than systemic problems, and this belief made it easier for politicians to underfund homelessness services and for communities to support policies that criminalize poverty rather than addressing its causes. William began to understand that his most important role might not be as a service provider or funder, but as someone who could use his platform to change public attitudes about homelessness and the people who experienced it. His royal status gave him access to media attention and political influence that could be used to challenge stereotypes and build support for evidence-based solutions. This realization would drive the next phase of his work, as he began using his public profile not just to support homelessness services but to advocate for the policy changes that could prevent homelessness from occurring in the first place. The turning point in Prince William's campaign against homelessness came during a harsh winter that tested everything he had learned and built over nearly a decade of work. It was January 2014, and Britain was experiencing one of its coldest winters in decades. Temperatures dropped to levels that made sleeping rough not just uncomfortable, but genuinely life-threatening, and homeless services across the country were overwhelmed by demand that far exceeded their capacity. William had spent the previous Christmas visiting emergency shelters and warming centers, expecting to see the usual strain on services but confident that the network of organizations he had been supporting would be able to meet the increased need. What he found instead was a system on the verge of collapse, with shelters turning away dozens of people every night and outreach workers finding people literally freezing to death in doorways and abandoned buildings. The statistics were horrifying, but the individual stories were what drove William to act. There was Peter, a 67-year-old man who had been sleeping rough for 6 months after losing his job and then his flat when he couldn't make rent. Peter had diabetes and needed regular medication and monitoring, but accessing healthcare while homeless had proved nearly impossible. On the night William met him, Peter's fingers were turning black with frostbite, and he was confused and disoriented from dangerously low blood sugar. There was Rachel, a 23-year-old woman who had fled an abusive relationship with her 2 young children. She had been staying in a friend's car for 3 weeks because there were no spaces available in women's refuges, and the local housing authority had told her she wasn't considered vulnerable enough to be placed in emergency accommodation. Her children, ages 3 and 5, were developing chest infections from sleeping in the unheated car. But Rachel was afraid to take them to a hospital because she worried social services would take them away from her. There was Marcus, an 18-year-old who had aged out of foster care just as winter set in. He had been sleeping in a 24-hour laundromat for warmth, but the owners had started calling police to move him on. Marcus was studying for his A-levels and had been accepted to university, but the constant stress of finding somewhere safe to sleep was making it impossible for him to focus on his studies. He was on the verge of dropping out, which would have ended his chance of escaping the cycle of poverty and homelessness. Each of these stories represented a failure of the systems that William had been working to strengthen for years. Despite all the partnerships he had built, all the funding he had helped raise, all the awareness he had tried to create, people were still falling through gaps that seemed to be getting wider rather than narrower. The crisis forced William to confront some uncomfortable truths about his own work and about the approach that well-meaning people like himself typically took to addressing homelessness. He realized that he had been focused on treating the symptoms of homelessness rather than addressing its underlying causes, that he had been supporting services that helped people survive homelessness rather than preventing them from becoming homeless in the first place. This recognition led William to spend several weeks in intensive discussions with policy experts, economists, and researchers who studied the structural factors that created and perpetuated homelessness. What he learned challenged many of his assumptions about what it would take to solve the problem. Professor Sarah Mitchell from the London School of Economics became one of William's key advisors during this period. Her research had shown that homelessness was primarily a function of housing availability and affordability rather than individual characteristics like mental illness or addiction. Countries with strong social housing programs and rent controls had much lower rates of homelessness, even when they had similar rates of poverty, mental illness, and substance abuse. Professor Mitchell's data showed that Britain's homelessness crisis was directly linked to policy decisions made over the previous 3 decades: the sale of council houses without replacement, the deregulation of private rental markets, the reduction in housing benefit, and the closure of mental health hospitals without adequate community-based alternatives. These policy changes had created a perfect storm of housing scarcity and affordability that made homelessness inevitable for increasing numbers of people. This analysis helped William understand why individual-level interventions, no matter how well-designed and well-funded, would never be sufficient to end homelessness. The problem was structural, which meant the solutions needed to be structural too. Armed with this new understanding, William began to shift his focus from service provision to policy advocacy. He started using his public platform to speak not just about the need for more homeless shelters and soup kitchens but about the need for more social housing, stronger tenant protections, and better integration of housing, health, and social services. This shift was not without controversy. Palace advisors worried that William was moving too far into political territory, especially when he began criticizing government policies that contributed to homelessness. Some conservative politicians accused him of overstepping his role as a future monarch, while some housing campaigners worried that his involvement would make housing policy seem like a charity issue rather than a matter of social justice. But William was determined to use whatever influence he had to address the root causes of homelessness, even if it meant making some people uncomfortable. He began working with a broader coalition of organizations, including tenant rights groups, public health advocates, and anti-poverty campaigners, to develop a comprehensive policy agenda for preventing and ending homelessness. The coalition's first major campaign focused on the connection between mental health services and homelessness. Research showed that up to 80% of people experiencing long-term homelessness had mental health problems, but mental health services were chronically underfunded and poorly coordinated with housing and social services. People were being discharged from mental health hospitals with nowhere to go, and people experiencing mental health crises while homeless were often criminalized rather than treated. William worked with the coalition to develop a model for integrated mental health and housing services that had been successful in other countries. The model involved co-locating mental health workers in housing services, providing long-term support for people with severe mental illness, and ensuring that housing was available for people being discharged from mental health treatment. The campaign to implement this model required William to engage directly with government ministers, NHS executives, and local authority leaders. These were not ceremonial meetings where he simply expressed concern about homelessness. They were detailed policy discussions where William presented evidence, proposed specific solutions, and pressed for concrete commitments and timelines. The breakthrough came when William convinced the Chancellor of the Exchequer to visit a pilot integrated mental health and housing program that had been running in Manchester for 2 years. The program had achieved remarkable results. 85% of participants remained stably housed after 18 months, emergency hospital admissions had dropped by 60%, and the program was actually saving money compared to the previous approach of repeatedly cycling people between hospital, prison, and the streets. Seeing the evidence firsthand convinced the Chancellor to announce new funding for mental health and housing integration programs in 10 cities across Britain. It wasn't everything the coalition had asked for, but it was a significant step forward and proof that evidence-based advocacy could achieve policy changes that would prevent thousands of people from experiencing homelessness. Building on this success, William and the coalition turned their attention to youth homelessness prevention. The data showed that most adult homelessness could be traced back to experiences in childhood and adolescence, family breakdown, aging out of foster care, school exclusion, involvement in the criminal justice system. If these risk factors could be identified and addressed early, much adult homelessness could be prevented. William worked with researchers to develop a youth homelessness prevention model that involved training teachers, social workers, police officers, and healthcare workers to recognize early warning signs of housing instability. When risk factors were identified, young people and their families would be connected with intensive support services designed to address the underlying problems before they led to homelessness. The model also included specialized support for young people leaving foster care, recognizing that these young people were at extremely high risk of homelessness, but that this risk could be dramatically reduced with the right kind of preparation and ongoing support. The program provided care leavers with dedicated housing workers, life skills training, educational support, and mentoring relationships with adults who had successfully navigated the transition from care to independent living. Piloting this prevention model required coordination between multiple government departments and dozens of local organizations. William used his convening power to bring all the necessary stakeholders together, and his influence to ensure that the pilot received adequate funding and political support. The results exceeded even the optimistic projections. In the pilot areas, youth homelessness dropped by 40% in the first year, and the program was showing positive returns on investment within 18 months. Young people who received prevention services were more likely to stay in education, less likely to become involved in the criminal justice system, and more likely to develop the skills and relationships they needed for successful adult lives. But perhaps the most significant outcome of Williams' policy advocacy work during this period was that it began to change how homelessness was discussed in public and political circles. Instead of being seen as an inevitable consequence of individual failings, homelessness was increasingly understood as a policy choice, something that could be reduced or eliminated through evidence-based interventions and adequate investment. This shift in understanding created space for more ambitious thinking about what might be possible. If homelessness was preventable, why accept that thousands of people should continue experiencing it? If other countries had successfully eliminated rough sleeping, why couldn't Britain do the same? These questions would drive the next phase of Williams' work, as he began to develop and advocate for a comprehensive strategy to end homelessness entirely rather than just managing it more humanely. It was an audacious goal, but the evidence was mounting that it was an achievable one if society was willing to commit the resources and political will necessary to make it happen. By 2018, Prince William had spent 15 years building networks, piloting programs, and advocating for policy changes that had helped thousands of people escape homelessness and prevented thousands more from experiencing it in the first place. But as he looked at the data, he realized that despite all these successes, the overall problem was not getting significantly smaller. New people were becoming homeless almost as quickly as others were being housed, and the fundamental systems that created homelessness remained largely unchanged. This realization led William to one of the most important decisions of his advocacy career. Instead of continuing to work around the edges of the homelessness crisis, he would commit himself to developing and implementing a comprehensive strategy to end homelessness entirely in Britain within 10 years. It was an audacious goal that many people told him was impossible, but William had spent enough time studying successful models from other countries to believe it was achievable if approached with sufficient ambition, coordination, and resources. The inspiration for this bold vision came partly from Finland's success in virtually eliminating rough sleeping through their housing-first approach, but also from William's growing understanding that incremental change would never be sufficient to address a problem as complex and entrenched as homelessness. What was needed was a fundamental transformation in how society approached housing, health services, social support, and economic opportunity. William began this new phase of his work by commissioning a comprehensive study of what it would actually take to end homelessness in Britain. He assembled a team of the country's leading experts in housing policy, public health, economics, and social services and asked them to develop a detailed, evidence-based plan for eliminating homelessness within a decade. The study took 18 months to complete and involved analyzing successful approaches from around the world, modeling the costs and benefits of different interventions, and consulting with hundreds of people who had experienced homelessness about what had helped them achieve stable housing and what barriers they had encountered. The resulting report, which became known as the Blueprint to End Homelessness, was both sobering and inspiring. It showed that ending homelessness would require an initial investment of approximately £8 billion over 5 years, a substantial sum, but less than the country was already spending on managing homelessness through emergency services, criminal justice involvement, and healthcare costs for people living rough. The blueprint identified 5 key components that would need to work together to eliminate homelessness. First, a massive expansion of truly affordable housing, including both social housing and housing benefit levels that allowed people to afford private rental accommodation. The study showed that housing costs had risen so dramatically compared to incomes that even people working full-time were at risk of homelessness if they experienced any financial shock like job loss or illness. Second, a transformation of mental health and addiction services to provide intensive, long-term support for people with severe problems. Instead of offering brief interventions that often failed to create lasting change, services would need to provide ongoing support for as long as needed, coordinated with housing and employment support. Third, a revolution in how society supported young people transitioning to adulthood, particularly those leaving foster care, youth detention, or abusive family situations. This would involve providing guaranteed housing and support for young people up to age 25, recognizing that the current expectation that 18-year-olds should immediately be able to live independently was unrealistic for many young people who had experienced trauma or instability. Fourth, a fundamental reform of the criminal justice system to end the cycle of homelessness and incarceration. This would involve ensuring that no one was released from prison without adequate housing arranged, providing intensive support for people with histories of offending who were trying to rebuild their lives, and decriminalizing behaviors like rough sleeping and begging that were symptoms of homelessness rather than choices. Fifth, a coordinated system for preventing homelessness by identifying and supporting people who were at high risk before they actually lost their housing. This would involve training workers in healthcare, education, criminal justice, and social services to recognize warning signs and connect people with preventive support. The blueprint was remarkable not just for its comprehensiveness, but for its specificity. It included detailed implementation timelines, identified the agencies and organizations that would need to be involved, calculated the number of new housing units that would need to be built, and estimated how many additional workers would need to be trained and deployed. But William understood that having a detailed plan was only the first step. The much harder challenge would be building the political will and public support necessary to implement such an ambitious strategy. This would require convincing politicians to make long-term investments in programs that might not show results until after the next election, and convincing taxpayers to support higher public spending on people who were often stigmatized and blamed for their own circumstances. William's approach to building support for the blueprint was characteristically thoughtful and strategic. Instead of simply presenting the plan to government ministers and hoping they would adopt it, he began a multi-year campaign 20 years ago. A young prince walked through the cold streets of London in the middle of winter. He wasn't there for a royal ceremony or official duty. He was there because his mother had taught him something that would shape the rest of his life. That real leadership means getting your hands dirty and your heart involved. That night, Prince William slept rough on the streets near Blackfriars Bridge. No cameras, no security detail nearby. No comfortable palace bed waiting for him. Just cardboard, a thin sleeping bag, and the harsh reality that thousands of people face every single night. When he woke up shivering at dawn, his body aching and his spirit shaken, he made a promise that would define 2 decades of his life. He promised that he would never stop fighting until every person had a safe place to call home. Now, 2 decades later, that promise has grown into something extraordinary. It has become a mission that has touched hundreds of thousands of lives, changed government policies, and proven that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to look away from suffering. This is the story of how one man's commitment turned into a movement that would challenge everything we thought we knew about homelessness, royalty, and what it really means to serve.